I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with the religious tradition of Christianity. Some of you might be actively involved as a believer in this particular religious tradition. That means perhaps a couple of things. One is, I would suggest that this week might be the toughest one of all for you to look at this particular tradition, if and to the extent to which you have lived inside of it, right? To step outside of it and look at it as if it is as new to you as perhaps Buddhism was. Do you think we can do that? I think we should give it a shot, okay? The other thing, I would also suggest that if indeed you are one of the people I'm describing, it is of crucial importance that you do exactly that you step outside of your religious tradition and look at it as if someone from a different culture and a different tradition might. Because then I suspect you will understand it in a way that you might never have before. And that understanding is crucial to the larger global conversation that I work here at Elon to encourage, to equip young people, and I know that the Truitt Center does exactly the same thing, to equip students from particular cultures and particular traditions, whatever that might be, right? To be open-minded to, have an understanding of, and be able to converse at a deep and meaningful level with those who are different. As the world shrinks and we become more globalized, where we're rubbing elbows, often without even having to travel, with those from cultures that might seem alien to us, this kind of understanding and that conversation becomes more and more crucial. In case you haven't noticed, there are a few wars and several conflicts going on in the world. Have you seen that in the news? Oh, yeah. Humans, what are you going to do, right? I suspect one of the reasons for many of those conflicts is this very lack of understanding from one culture to another. And if we can build this conversation, right? Well, I would just suggest that it behooves us. It is in our own enlightened self-interest to do so. And I cannot overstress how important it is, how important it is. It will enrich us as individuals. It will enrich American culture, if indeed that is your culture. And it will build bridges for the future, for generations to come, for generations to come. I don't know if you have had a family member serve in a conflict or be the victim of a conflict. If so, you have an idea of what I'm talking about, right? I am still a hippie, and I believe in the possibility of world peace. I'm about to go evangelistic on you here, okay? I believe it in the bottom of my heart. Is it going to happen in my lifetime? I kind of doubt it. Can I maybe, in what small influence I have, push in that direction? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I still believe. I still believe. Now, to the matter at hand. We have been talking about narrative. What an important role narrative plays, not only in religious traditions, you know, it's all about the stories at one level, right? But in our own self-identities. We are story-making beings. It's what we do. It's how we make sense of an otherwise chaotic world, right? And when we made that turn last session from the east to the west, we really had to look directly into the role, first of all, the central role of Scripture in the Western religious traditions, also known as the religions of the book. The religions of the book, right? Absolutely crucial. And these stories that are told for a reason, are told for a reason. This week, we need to talk about Christianity. And there's something else a little bit different that we're going to do. Now, we did talk about the Buddha, and we talked about the Buddha in some detail, right? Considered to be the historical founder of Buddhism. Today, needless to say, I can't cover 2,000 years of Christian history in an hour, okay? Forget about it, right? But I'd like to concentrate on Jesus. Who is Jesus? And how do we know? What can we know? What can we perhaps not know? And what difference does it make? Okay? And guess what? I'm going to start with a story. In the first century of the Common Era, there was a man whose birth had long been prophesied. He was born of a virgin and considered to be the Son of God. Even as a child, he was wise beyond his years. When he became a man, he taught many people and performed many wondrous miracles. He had many followers. But eventually, although he lived an innocent life, his popularity put him on the wrong side of the religious and political authorities. And so he was tried, accused of blasphemy and treason, and ultimately abused by those authorities. Later, he appeared to his followers, who were quite frightened because they thought that he was a ghost. And eventually, they came to believe that he was a divine man. Finally, he was taken up to heaven to live with God forever. Now, whose life story did I just tell? That is the life story of Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius of Tyana, something of a contemporary of Jesus, right? Who lived in a little town in Greece called Tyana. The point I am trying to make, and I am jerking your chain a little bit, of course. Do you see the parallels, the striking parallels with the life of Jesus, right? Oh yeah. The point I'm trying to make is Jesus is, as we have already seen actually, is by no means the only person in the ancient world who is considered to be divine, right? You find it in so many different traditions. And here it is, right? Here it is. Jesus Christ. I have to ask, is it Joseph and Mary Christ and their little son, Jesus? No. Did any of you hear Bart Ehrman the other night? Dr. Ehrman, right? Who you'll hear some echoes here today because he is the man who taught me much of what I know about the New Testament, at least from the outsider perspective, while I was a student at the University of North Carolina. No, it's not the Christ family, okay? Well, if it's not his name, then what is it? I mean, think Buddha. It's a title of respect and honor, right? And we have to ask the same question we did with the Buddha. What does it mean? What does it mean? It comes from the Greek Christos. The Greek Christos, which is actually a translation of a Hebrew term, Masya. Masya. Now, Masya comes into English, does it not? What is it? Messiah. Messiah. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves today, one of them, are we talking about Handel's Messiah? Every valley. Right? The almighty, eternal, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent creator of the universe? Is it Handel's Messiah? Well, the approach we need to take today, we need to go back to the first century as much as we possibly can, before Christianity has been invented. Here's your job. You have to bracket Christianity for a while. The 2,000 years since, right? You gotta, if we're really gonna see Jesus in his historical context, right? As much as we possibly can, since we are taking this historical approach, we need to see him in that context, right? Who was he? First question, was he a Christian? No. What was he? He was Jewish? Well, let me ask you this. In the Jewish tradition, then as now, can a man be God? Forget about it. No, a man cannot be God, right? God is God. Man can't be God. Jesus is a Jew. His followers are Jews. How did they come to see him as a God? How did that happen? Bada boom, bada bing. What? How did it happen? I mean, once they started talking about this, it spread like wildfire. Did it happen overnight? Well, did the Buddha come to be seen as a God overnight? No. In his case, it took hundreds of years, right? But eventually, and even today, about half of the Buddhists consider Siddhartha to be a divine being, the other half not so much. How did he come to be seen as a God? How did a Jewish movement turn into this other thing? What is the evolution? How did that happen? That's what we want to try to look at today. But in order to do so, we need to peel back these layers of history, as I say, as much as we can. What does the term Masya mean in its historical context? Well, it certainly doesn't mean Handel's Messiah, right? It means one who is anointed. You know what it means to be anointed? My Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, did you get christened as a child? Well, you realize, I'm speaking as a Baptist here, that on your forehead is going to heaven. You know that, don't you? No, you got to be dunked. You need the full Monty, right? No, totally kidding. Totally kidding. To be anointed, right? To be anointed. Well, it comes from one of the major traditions in Jewish history on the day that their king was coronated. The chief prophet of the land would anoint his head with oil to show what? That he's God's eternal son? These are Jews. They're Jewish, right? No, it's not that. What does it mean? It means he is special. He is set aside as the king, the political ruler of the nation of Israel. Okay? That's the context. That is the context. So in the first century of the Common Era, when Jesus' disciples referred to him as, it gets translated into Greek, right, as Christ, Christos, as Jews, what they are saying is Masya, Messiah. So what are they saying about Jesus? Hello. I hope that wasn't my phone. They're saying that he's the king of Israel. They're making a political statement and not the religious statement that it eventually becomes, right? There's a moment in the Gospels when Jesus takes his closest disciples aside, and he was wont to do that from time to time, because he wants to ask them some questions. And he asks them, right, who is it that people say that I am? And they give him several different options. And then he turns the question directly on them, and he says, but who do you say that I am? Now, who spoke up? He always spoke up. I love Peter. Oh, what a wonderful blunderbuss, right? Yeah, I'm glad he's the gatekeeper. What did Peter say? This is crucially important. What did he say? What did Peter say? Is that what he said? That's how it gets interpreted. That is exactly how it gets interpreted by the church. Now, there's no church, right? We've gone back in time. Peter says, You are the Christ, right? You are Christos in the Greek, right? You are Masya. What is Peter saying about Jesus? That he's the eternal Son of God forever, ever, and amen? No. What is he saying? You are the king. Why was Jesus executed? Well, let me ask you this. What did the plaque above his head say? On the cross, on the very cross, right? What did it say? That's exactly what it was. The King of the Jews. The King of the Jews. That term gets interpreted differently, right? But in its historical context. I mean, think about that for a moment, okay? And the question I have, at least, is who is this guy, this king of Israel who never actually sat on the throne of Israel? And how do we find out? How do we find out? And this is where approaches differ, and it's important to understand the difference in the approach. You have the insider approach, right? And Christians will explain to you how they come to believe that, right? But if you look at it from the outside, it might look a little bit different. If we're taking a historical approach, which I've tried to do all the way through these sessions as much as we can, how is it that historians find out what happened in the past? What do they look for?
Documentation.
Absolutely, you got to have documentation. You need historical sources. You need sources, and the closer they are to whoever you happen to be looking for, or whatever event you happen to be looking for, right? And the more of them there are, and the more closely those agree. All of those things become very important. So what are our sources for figuring out who Jesus is? Our historical sources, okay? Our historical. Now, needless to say, Jesus, the Christ, has had a huge impact on the last 2,000 years of history. Would you agree with me on that? Yes. And continues to this day. But if we go back to the first century, how important was this man in his own day and in the decades afterwards? How important do you think he was? And he made such a huge splash eventually. Let's do this. We can divide the sources into three different layers, if you will, right? The broadest context in terms of historical sources would be the Roman world in which we find him at this time, right? So let's look at the Roman sources. Within that, we've seen that Jesus was a Jew, right? The Jewish sources. And within that, right, we can assume these are the closest to him, though, as we shall see if we have time, that claim is sometimes somewhat problematic. The closest sources, right, would be the Christian sources, the sources written by his followers, okay? You with me so far? Let's exclude the inner circle, right, the Christian sources. Let's exclude the Jewish sources, right, for the moment, and just look at the Roman context. In the entire first century of the Common Era, how many references do we find to Jesus in those Roman sources? Zero. Not a one. Not a one. It's only in the first couple of decades of the second century where you begin to, the earliest seem to be letters back and forth between Roman local rulers trying to figure out what to do with these followers of this guy Jesus because they're causing them some problems. They don't want to cooperate. They certainly don't want to worship Caesar, right? Who, by the way, had come to be understood as a divine man. Well, there you go. There's another one, right? Okay, nothing from the Romans. Let's go to the Jewish sources. Jesus, a Jew. Followers Jewish. How many references in that first century of the Common Era from the Jewish circle outside of those Jews who became Christian? How many? Wouldn't you think there would be a bunch? There's one. One. The entire first century of the Common Era, one. A Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, writing a history of the Jews, refers to Jesus briefly, and I mean briefly. This is what Josephus tells us, and think about it. If the other sources had not survived, this is all, Jesus would be a blip in history, right? Jesus was called Masya. We know what that means in the Jewish context, right? He had some followers. He was crucified under the Roman official Pontius Pilate, and his brother James led his followers after his death. That's it. Just bare bones, right? Bare bones. So let's go to that inner circle. What about the Christian sources? What about the Christian sources? How many books in the New Testament? That's their book. 27. 27 books. Most of those are letters, also known as epistles, right? I had a student say once that he thought the epistles were the wives of the apostles, but that's not right. You hear so much. Oh. 27, okay. For the moment, see, we're narrowing it down, okay? Let's bracket the Gospels. Wait a minute, how many Gospels? 4? We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, let's bracket the Gospels out, because that's where we find the most information, right? Outside of the Gospels, 23 books, right? Books, I say books. Most of them are letters, right? Most of them are letters. One of them, at least, is written by, as far as we can tell, and New Testament scholars, biblical scholars, almost unanimously agree that whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, and did you notice how I said that? Whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, because we don't really know who wrote the Gospel of Luke, any more than we know who wrote Matthew or Mark or John. Those names, it seems, have been appended to the books. A very common practice, no hanky-panky going on here. Appended to those books later, right? Again, think about Moses writing those first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures, or not, right? Yeah, you get authority by doing this. But whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, it seems, also wrote the book of Acts. Well, that's a huge chunk of the New Testament right there, okay? Who wrote most of those letters in the New Testament? Oh, Paul. Oh, Paul. You might as well refer to this religious tradition as Paulinity as much as Christianity, because it is Paul and Paul's version of who Jesus was, his opinions, his take on Jesus, if you will, that has so shaped Christian theology down, and not just theology, ethics, right? Authority structures, right? I mean, hugely, hugely important. And I don't want to steal my own thunder here, but I think Paul might have had something to do with how this originally Jewish movement became another animal, right? That it took on this other, when we first mentioned Jesus' name, we had to translate from his language, right? Hebrew, or actually Aramaic, similar, to Christos, Greek. Was the New Testament written in Hebrew, the language of the Jews? No, it was written in Greek, right? Greek being, not unlike English today, the lingua franca of the time, right? But was it just a matter of translating the words into Greek? If you read Paul's writings, you begin to see, and I've read his letters. Now, it's weird reading somebody else's mail. But I don't think he meant them to be private. And not only did Paul write in Greek, Paul thought in Greek ways. Now, what do you know about Greek mythology, Greek religion? Let me ask you this. Were the Greeks monotheistic? Just one God? Are there any divine men in Greek mythology? where the gods and humans come together? It's a very common notion. It's a very common notion, right? And I wonder if Paul might be a stepping stone here. And I don't just wonder it. I'm actually quite sure of it, just based on the evidence. In Paul's letters, and this is not unrelated to what I was just saying about Paul, and the way that he understood Jesus because of the way he understood the world and humans' relationship with the divine, Paul doesn't talk very much about Jesus as a human being. In fact, again, if the Gospels had not survived, what we had to go on was Paul, right? Paul's writings, we would know almost nothing about Jesus as a person who walked around on earth. Paul talks at length about Jesus as Handel's Messiah, as the Son of God, as all-powerful, right? But to look at him as a human in a Jewish context, you're just not going to get that from Paul. You're not going to get that. For one thing, Paul never knew him. As far as we know, never met him, right? Never met him. Shows up later, right? So basically, if we want to know who Jesus, the historical person, was, not so much the Christ of faith, right? We're holding that off for the moment, but the Jesus of history, if you will, the sources we have to go on pretty much are the Gospels. I'll ask you again, how many? There's just one gospel. That's what I was taught. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Why 4? One wasn't good enough? No, seriously, why not? Why 4? And do they all agree? They're historical sources. Do they agree? How reliable are the sources? That's the crucial question, right? The crucial question. And I always feel a little guilty teaching this religion. If my Sunday school teacher, Bertie Mae Bates, could see me doing this, she would probably have a little word prayer with me afterwards. I don't know, right? And I got to tell you, I went to college and I believed, what I had been taught. There's one gospel. The Bible, there's no error whatsoever in that book, right? Christianity is the only true religion. Every one of the others is wrong. Anybody who believes those other religions, billions and billions down through history, is going to bust hell wide open. Praise God. That's what I believed when I went to school. But then I sat in this world religions class, and then I took a church history class and really started studying the New Testament, and it just blew my mind. And I have to tell you, I went through a crisis period. Cognitive dissonance. Do you know that term? You know whether you know the term or not. You know what it feels like. It's like your brain has a cramp or something, right? Because you know what my mind was telling me, right? And what my heart was telling me were so different. And I did not know how to reconcile the two. And it was a tough time. It was a tough time. And it's been over the years, really. Even while I've been here at Elon, it's still troubling to me, right? I get in a classroom, it's one of the reasons I love to teach, and get with young people who think new thoughts and think in ways that some of us probably don't anymore. There's a courage, right? And it's unweighted by life's experience. Now, oftentimes it's unaided by life's experiences as well. But I love being around young people because it's okay to think different. They don't have to think the way we do, and they know it, and that's why they give their parents a hard time. I'm sure that never happened to any of you. And in your own time, I'm sure you didn't do it to your parents. No, of course not, right? But to try to figure out a different way of understanding this that didn't jettison either one, that didn't just shut down my brain, that was not a possibility anyway, nor just lop off my heart. It's been tough. It's been tough. The Gospels, 4 of them, the one question we have to ask, do they agree? Do the 4 Gospels agree? Well, if you Ask people from my tradition, absolutely they do, in every single detail, right? And you can see them, right, make them agree, even when they don't necessarily seem to, right? For them, this is a fact. It really is, right? And I'm not here, and I need you to know this, right? And I could have said it about any one of the traditions. In fact, I think I did, first day. I said, I'm not here to preach one religion over another, right? No. What I really want to do is apply the same kind of scrutiny to this religious tradition that I have to the others. This one I know in more detail, right? You could do exactly the same thing, and scholars do, with the Buddha. How do we know who he was? What are the sources? How reliable are they, and why? Always some gray area, but what you can see if you study the work of scholars over the decades, that some clarity really begins to come out, right, about what might be true. True in the sense in which we in the West insist upon it. Historical accuracy, right? I mean, when Buddhists look at fundamentalists in other religious traditions, perhaps even in their own, they're just flummoxed by this whole insistence on it's got to be factual, right? It's got to be true. Because if it's not, if one thing in these teachings is wrong, the whole thing blows up. Well, that's kind of strict, don't you think? There doesn't seem to be any room for play, right? Where's the new revelation going to come from when you already have it, when it's just carved in stone, man? Where does the new, how do we meet the divine if it has to be just this way? Well, 4 Gospels. I can tell you what scholars have found. As far as we can tell, and again, we're talking about a consensus among biblical scholars, Mark is the earliest gospel. It's the shortest one. It's the quickest one. He just gets in there and gets out, right? John is the latest one. Matthew and Mark in between. Mark written, as far as we can tell, sometime between 60 and 70 CE. Now think about that for a moment, 60 and 70 CE. When did Jesus die?
28 CE.
Well, you're both right or not. We don't really know. We're not sure when he was born. Okay, newsflash, he wasn't born at the stroke of midnight on December the 25th of the year. Would it be 1 or 0? I'm not sure which. No. We're not really sure, right? So, that's kind of weird to think, isn't it? I mean, this might not be 2014. We might still be partying like it's 1999. We just don't know it. Well, okay, so let's, maybe 6 years, give or take, right? So let's just say that Jesus dies in the year 30, okay, for the sake of argument, in the year 30. Mark's gospel, the earliest account of the life, death of Jesus, 30 years later, at least. 30 years. What was happening 30 years ago? 30 years ago. What it was? 1984? Well, I was a lot younger. I don't know about you. 39. Okay, Reagan is president. All right, let's go with this, okay? If someone were writing about Reagan's presidency during his presidency, do you think they might write it a little differently than if they were writing about Reagan's presidency now, given all the water that's gone under the bridge in the meantime, right? I think so. 30 years. Well, wait a minute. What, did Mark just go, I remember, I better sit down and write this down? How did those stories survive in the meantime? That's what I want to know. 30 years. Oral tradition, right? That's the way it works. Oral tradition. Mark finally, whoever he was, right, sits down, writes this book, but you can tell that he's drawing from other sources. Right? In fact, you can tell even more so with Matthew and Luke. Because if you look at Matthew and Luke, what you will find is almost the entire Gospel of Mark appears in both of those Gospels. Are they guilty of plagiarism? No. The ancient world, very common practice, right? Almost the entire Gospel of Mark shows up. Now, what does that tell you about Matthew and Luke? Apparently, they had Mark's Gospel. I mean, much of it is word for word. So apparently, Mark is a source, a historical source, for Matthew and Luke. Here's the kicker. All right, we got 3 out of 4. John. John's Gospel is radically different. Apparently, he didn't have Mark. If he did, he didn't use it. Right? He has other sources. And he has a very different view of who Jesus was. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus still seems to be human. I mean, you see him doing human things, right? Now, Mark's gospel is in such a hurry, either he didn't use or he didn't have any sources for the birth of Jesus. Maybe those stories hadn't really become popular yet, right? You don't get anything. He shows up around 30 years old, boom, right? Starts preaching after he gets baptized. Dunked, thank you. No. It's in Matthew and Luke that you begin to get those marvelous, right? Those mythical stories, from my childhood about Jesus being born. Okay? What is the very first verse of the Gospel of John? The very first verse of the Gospel. I want you to listen to how different this sounds, okay? In the beginning was what? A tiny little baby child? No, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and here we go. The Word was God. From the beginning, in John's Gospel, Jesus is already divine. We have stepped outside the Jewish world, where humans are humans and God is God. I was not taught that in my church. They all link up perfectly, which is one way of reading it, right? But there are other ways as well. And that whole oral tradition thing makes me a little nervous. Have you ever played the game telephone or pass it on? You know what I'm talking about? If I was to tell you a story and you tell him, it goes all the way around the room. By the time he gets back to me, what's happened to it? Oh, good. Forget about it, right? Now, I say that oral tradition tends to be more flexible, say, than written tradition. But I want to give a couple of provisos, right? One is that in the ancient world, people were a lot better about remembering stuff. Because for one thing, they couldn't carry around that little magic picture box that everybody has in their pockets, right? No virtual memory, right? You remembered more. It's one of the reasons stories were so popular. The other thing too, and this Ehrman taught me because it is his area of specialty, just because there's a written tradition doesn't mean there's not still some flexibility and evolution of the tradition itself. Because Ehrman looks at, and he showed us in class, some of the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels. Now, none of them are originals, not even close, right? Not centuries later, those are the earliest fragments that we have, right? And you can see if you read Greek, you can see the differences even in the same gospel. That the tradition is growing and changing and evolving as traditions do. Look at Buddhism. Look at every one of these religious traditions and you'll find the same thing. You'll also find some people in those traditions who are okay with that, and you will find some people in those traditions who say, absolutely, that cannot be the case. Because they have certain beliefs about it, yeah.
When was John written?
As far as we know, if Mark was written around 60 to 70, John 90 CE, towards the end of the first century.
Oh, okay, so it's 30 years.
30 years, give or take. And you have to wonder if that is one of the reasons why John's gospel is so different. 30 more years of this tradition being passed along and growing, and people's understanding of who Jesus was or might have been evolving. Plus, the movement is spreading outside of its original Jewish context. And now it's intermingling with that broader context, the Roman Empire, where this Greek culture, you know, the Romans took over for the Greeks, right? The process of Hellenization has pretty much taken place, right? Where, again, the Greek language is widespread and Greek thinking is widespread. If you know anything about Alexander the great Greek general, every place that guy went, well, first of all, he kicked butt, si vous pardonnerez mon français, and secondly, he took Greek culture with him, right? The Greek arts, Greek schools, Greek thinking. And it actually shows up right here in the New Testament. In the New Testament. Another thing that needs to be taken into consideration is the way that stories are told. I don't know about you, but I'm guessing there's a joke that you know that you might tell your best friend in one way, but you might tell your mama in a very different way. It depends on your audience, right? It depends on your audience. It also depends on your purpose. What are you looking to do with this story that you were telling? And as I say, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you do get some sense of a historical human being, but John tells you right up front, these things I write, what? To give you historical information centuries later? That you might believe. That you might believe, right? He is owning his, well, and I don't mean this in a bad way, don't take me wrong, his bias, right? His slant. This is why I am writing this, right? Not to be completely objective, but for a particular purpose, and that particular purpose, as he said from the get-go, is to convince you that Jesus is not just a man, but he's a God.
His audience changed, though, because the Jews had been dispersed in years. So they were not the targeted audience that the other three Gospels.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, the audience changes as that first century progresses, and even more in the second and third centuries. That is another element of what is going on here. You have to take into consideration your audience, right? Your audience. And you're going to speak to different groups different ways. John, obviously, in a more Greek context, if you will. I mean, the very fact that the New Testament is not written in the language of the people it is about, but in a different language. Have you learned a second language? It's really not just a matter of this word means that, is it? I mean, think about the cultural differences. All of that comes into play. And it makes this a rather complex phenomenon. And I just really want us to appreciate that because, again, as a young person, I didn't hear a lot of complexity. It was all simple and black and white and the truth with a capital T. And if you question, oh. Is he speaking about a different person, John, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Historically speaking, I mean, I think they're talking about the same person, right? The question is, it seems to me that by the time John's gospel gets written, he's no longer just a person. He's become this other thing, this other being, right? This God-man, this God-man. Are there glimpses of that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Absolutely, absolutely. Where does that come from? Well, okay, thank you. Isaiah, yes. Is that a Jewish interpretation of Isaiah, though? No, it's not, right? No, it's not. That is a Christian interpretation of Isaiah. We talked about prophets and prophesying last time, didn't we? Here's where it comes. Holy cow. Time flies when you're having fun. Yes. This is where Paul comes in. This is where, if you look at Jesus in his context, was Jesus from Jerusalem? No, he's from Mebane, right? He's a small town boy. Yes, right? Who hit the big time, if you will, right? There's no indication that he understood Greek, that he thought in Greek terms, right? Just a local boy. Paul, Jerusalem, well-educated, wrote, thought Greek fluently, which is to say, Jesus is in the Jewish world. Paul has a foot in the Jewish world as a Jew, but he's this cosmopolitan Jew who also has his foot in the broader world, right? Which puts him in a very important position because he is one of the few who can actually translate, as you were mentioning, to this broader Greek context, right? What happens in the meantime, though, in the mind of Paul, and it's impossible to read the mind of Paul, but certainly in his writings, it seems as if this Jesus is understood differently, in a way that would make a lot more sense to Greeks than to Jews. Did the majority of Jewish people follow this movement? Well, there you go, right? There you go.
Where's Paul on the timeline now?
Thank you. That's exactly where I was going. Exactly. Where is Paul? Now, Paul, who's considered to be the first missionary, right? He gets a hold of this message about Jesus, and he's the first one to think, all right, we got to spread this, right? And he starts traveling with it and taking it to these different churches, which is why he's writing those letters back to the churches, right? Where he's gone and convinced people to become followers and then, help them to form a group there that will last and spread the word. He's actually going all the way around the Mediterranean. The dude's on his way to Spain, man, at the far end of the Mediterranean Sea. Unfortunately, he's captured in Rome and killed. Sometime in the mid-7th decade, right? 64, 65 CE, something like that. Now think about that for a moment. He's already had his entire ministry. He's the one who most popularized this view of Jesus that you find in John's Gospel, the Messiah as Handel's Messiah, and not the literal political king of the Jews. He's already had his entire ministry by the time, as far as we can tell, Mark's Gospel is written. And you read those Gospels, and what you see is Paul's version of Jesus. Is this making sense? Sort of, kind of? I mean, it's okay, yeah. And I know it is different than what you might have heard, okay, for some of you at least. But it's crucial to take in consideration. It's important, right? People have labored years, decades, a couple of centuries actually, to try to figure out, historically speaking, what we can and cannot know about this figure from the first century Jesus, right? And it's crucial to understand it. It's crucial to understand it. And what you do with it is up to you. I had to figure out my own way. I had to figure out, and it took a long time, and blood, sweat, and tears. To this day, I still feel somewhat guilty, right? But I also feel free and honest with myself. Because I just had to figure out my own answers. And why should anyone feel guilty for that? A God who does not want us to question, I'm not sure I want to have anything to do with a divine being who seems that uptight. He gave us brains, right? Let us use them. That is how the divine has been revealed throughout history. I think it's one of the reasons we're talking about Jesus today, and we talked about the Buddha a couple of weeks ago, and Moses, right? Because these were men who did exactly that. They were willing to ask questions, to look at things in a different way, right? And to create a new kind of conversation, right? An inclusive conversation. Unfortunately, all too often what happens among their followers is, this is ours, it's not yours. This is ours. Oh, we got the right one, we got the true one. Sorry about you, right? Wait a minute, what now? Jesus himself said, why did you forsake me on the cross? Yeah. Say a little bit more about what you mean by that. No, help me out here. Come on. Oh, I think I see what you're saying. That he himself was willing and able to question, even in that moment. Even in that moment. Yeah, it's a question we all ask. You know, you're standing at the funeral and just, and just wondering. You know, I read about the guy going in to the Jewish Community Center, right, with a gun out of hatred. I mean, this is what I'm talking about, right? This is why it's crucial. I think about all those young people we sent into Iraq and Afghanistan, and you can say, you know, the president did it, but you and I did it. We sent those young people into those cultures with no idea, little if any, of the cultures they would be dealing with. And guess what? Oh, how could that possibly have happened? We should have learned a long time ago, but we didn't. So that's why I see this as crucial, and that we respect one another and be as open as we possibly can in our minds and our hearts. It's the pathway to peace. We will not be meeting next week in honor of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Right? How convenient, right? But the following week we will, I'm kind of sad to see this come to an end. We will conclude our series by looking into the religion of Islam. And I wish you well in the meantime.